evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, economist and columnist for The Australian, Judith Sloan. Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. The Chair of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, Elizabeth Proust. Oxford-educated economist and Minister for Law Enforcement, Angus Taylor. And the Director of the Australia Institute, Ben Oquist. Please welcome our panellists. So Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio, but not, as it happens, on News 24. Our first question tonight comes from Matt Unicom.
So governments like to talk about cutting taxes, but really what they're doing is winding back the effect of bracket creep, which is pretty sly. This budget aims to diminish their ability to do that by reducing or actually abolishing the 37% tax rate. Some people say that's unfair because a middle-income earner and a high-income earner would be paying a similar or the same marginal tax rate. Does the panel think this is fair?
Angus Taylor, we'll start with you. It's your budget.
Well, I do think it's fair, Matt. Look, fairness needs to be judged in a couple of different ways. First of all, a fair budget is one which creates opportunities for everybody, opportunities to get into a job, opportunities to get ahead if you're in business or get ahead if you're building your career. And I think this is a budget that does it because it contains the level of taxation, because it's all about encouraging investment, it's about encouraging new jobs and ultimately about encouraging increases in wages, which is something we need to see, and we know that's associated with increased investment. The combination of the company tax cuts as well as a personal income tax plan which maintains a high degree of progressivity, which is critical to fairness, but at the same time ensures that middle-income Australians know that in all likelihood, 94% of them, they'll be paying no more than 32.5 cents in the dollar, which gives them the opportunity to get out and have a crack, earn a dollar, make a buck and do well, and that's what we want to see. OK, well, that's a good preamble. And you mentioned the 32.5%. It's a radical step to move to a flat tax. Malcolm Turnbull was talking about it in his first year in government, but you're about to do it. 94% of Australians, of workers at least, on the same tax rate. So if you're earning $41,000 or $200,000, you'll be on the same tax rate. Yep. And the question is that fair? Well, that's not right, Tony, and this is a very important point. If you're earning $200,000, Bill Shorten's doctors, and he was pitting doctors against nurses, an unfortunate pitting of people against each other. But if you're on $200,000, you'll be paying an average tax rate of about 30%. If you're on $40,000, you'll be paying an average tax rate of closer to 10%. So you're saying this has been reported incorrectly everywhere? Well, I'm saying people are confusing two different things. One is the marginal tax rate. What do I get if I earn another dollar? And that's critical to drive incentives. We want marginal tax rates which encourage people to get out there and have a crack. The average tax rate is what matters for equity. Let's hear from Chris Bowen on that.
Well, there's a couple of points. Firstly, of course, when you said the government's seeking to abolish the tax bracket, yes, in 2024. Now, this is a government which last year told us we needed to increase personal income tax, and anybody who opposed the increase was un-Australian and getting in the way of good reform and looking after the disabled community. Now, 12 months later, we're told, oh, we don't need that tax increase, but we're told we know the government is all-knowing about what the economy is going to be like in 7 years' time, and we'll be able to afford this tax cut then. Now, what's going to happen, of course, is if the Liberal Party won the 2018 election and the 2021 election and was in office in 2024, better than even money bet, they say, oh, look, the world economy's turned down, we can't afford this anymore, we're going to have to take it back. Point one. This is on the never-never. This is a hoax in many senses. Secondly, your point goes to a very important one. Does it actually improve the fairness of the tax system? There's a strong argument that it doesn't. Despite what Angus says, the fact of the matter is the marginal tax rate, nobody said average tax rates, that was never the suggestion. The marginal tax rate for somebody on $41,000 will be the same as somebody on $200,000. That's a huge change in the system. Yes, we're all concerned about bracket creep. Yes, we want to make sure there's incentive in the system. But we also want to keep the fundamental fairness of the system. And there's a very strong argument that the majority of these benefits actually go to higher income earners, and it's not a good or a fair change. Now, we strongly support the tax cuts that apply in this year. They're fair. We support them. But don't hold them hostage to some never-never plan which may or may not ever happen, even if the Liberal Party gets its way.
All right, I'll just get Angus Taylor to respond to that. I mean, it's right, isn't it? I mean, you'd have to win 2 more elections at least in order to even get to the point where you could think about doing this, and you're trying to legislate for it.
Well, let me pick up on a couple of points Chris just made. The first point is he's talking about long-term tax plan. Well, Australians want to see a plan for where a government takes the country. But I tell you what, you're very quick to go out there with long-term spending plans. But when it comes to tax plans, no way. And the reason for that is simple. You need tax going up through bracket creep in order to pay for your very extravagant spending promises.
Okay, we're going to come to that issue. We're talking right now about your tax plan, and I want to hear from the rest of the panellists. Ben Oquist.
Well, the tax plan is unfair. I mean, I accept your point that the long-term tax plan and the company tax cuts are the centrepiece of the budget, and you've got a theory about why they'll work. But in essence, those longer-term tax cuts in particular that kick in over 7 years are unfair. 62% of the benefit of those tax cuts goes to the top 20% of income earners. They're supposedly designed to address bracket creep. Now, bracket creep can be a problem, but also bracket creep can be a good thing. If you're earning more in real terms, you pay more. That's the basis of our progressive taxation system. That's a good idea. Yes, when it comes to inflation, you want to address bracket creep, but it's a small problem at the moment. We've got low inflation, we've got low wages growth, and yet we've come in with this big tax plan, $140 billion to address bracket creep that makes the system unfairer. Now, you can argue that it's still progressive. It is still progressive under the new system, but the government itself argues that it's being made flatter. Being made flatter means unfairer. And I'll tell you one other thing. The Australian Institute's got some research coming out this week that shows not only is it unfair, we've demonstrated that the top 20% get 62% of the benefit, but it's women who lose out with these tax cuts. 65% of the benefits of these tax cuts go to men. Double the benefit of these tax cuts goes to men over women. So they're unfair. Inequality is the issue of our age. They're going to make inequality worse, and they're not going to... they're a ticking revenue time bomb.
Okay.
$140 billion cost to the budget in 7 years' time.
OK, I'll come back to you, Angus, to answer some of those issues. Elizabeth Proust, what do you think? I mean, do you take the flat tax plan seriously, or is it just too far in the future to believe in?
I think I'd say a few things. One, the tax cuts this year to low and middle income earners are welcome. But our position has been for some time now, and it's not on the agenda of either the government or the opposition, but that what we need is broad-based tax reform. So we at the AICD have argued now for a number of years for lowering the company tax rate. It's too high, and other countries have taken theirs down. Our personal income tax rates are too high, and yet our GST is one of the lowest in the world. So we've argued for reform of negative gearing, reform of GST, reduction in personal income tax with compensation for people who are affected by a rise in GST, and a reduction in the company tax. Now, it's not on the agenda.
We're going to come and talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. Just on this flat tax plan.
Fair this year, but I think in the out years, it's marginally unfair.
Because of too much benefit to richer people?
Yes, that's right.
OK. Now, Judith, what do you think?
Well, I actually disagree with that. And, I mean, we can fiddle around with figures a lot, Ben. And, in fact, you dismiss the impact of fiscal drag, as we call bracket creep. It's a great name, isn't it?
I don't dismiss it. It's a small problem, not a big problem.
OK, up until now, the only budget repair that's occurred is actually because of fiscal drag, but bracket creep. Who are the groups worst affected by fiscal drag? They're actually in quintile 2 and 3. You're women, actually. So I don't know where you're getting your figures from.
But this is...
They are the worst. Sorry?
The long-term tax plan eliminates bracket creep at the top, not at the bottom.
No, that's absolutely...
So it doesn't address bracket creep really at the bottom.
That's absolutely untrue.
No, it's not.
And you see, when you say that 62% of the gains go to the top, they're paying 75%.
Judith, a lot of people are going to get a little confused by the detail that you're going into here. Just talk to the idea of moving, I could call it economic jargon. Go to the flat tax idea and it happening in 6 years' time, 2 governments away. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I mean, people are always calling out for long-term thinking and for plans as opposed to short-term thinking, so it must get the tick for that. When you say it's flat tax, it's not really. We've got the tax-free threshold. then we've got 19%. So basically we're just cutting out...
Flatter, indeed.
Yeah,
A lot flatter.
Yeah.
Sure. But it's not as radical as you're proposing. I mean, a flat tax would be radical. This is just cutting out the 37 cents, right?
But it's a $25 billion cost per year when it comes in. That's radical.
But Ben, let's be clear. This remains one of the most progressive tax systems in the OECD, in the Western world.
But it's going to be made less progressive.
Let me finish, please. And there's two aspects of that. One is the top threshold cuts in at about double the average income. That is low in comparative terms. And secondly, it comes in, including the Medicare levy, at 47 cents in the dollar. So now that puts us in one of the most progressive tax systems in the world, and of course that plays out with what Judith says about the tax-free threshold. So the average level of tax we pay as your income goes up, and it's why the nurse that we talked about will be paying only 10% tax, and the doctor that we talked about on 200,000 is paying 30% tax. That's how our system works.
It's being made less progressive. I'll give you another
a
very quick stat. When John Howard was just 1 second. When John Howard was Prime Minister,
hang on, you're talking over each other. I have to stop that.
Okay.
When John Howard was Prime Minister,
I haven't had much of a go.
When John Howard was Prime Minister,
I guess
13% of the tax. I'm sorry, missed that.
Well, you would.
When
Judith is making the point that she's been cut off because she's a woman. We'll go back to her in a moment. Finish your point.
You've had a good go.
One quick point. 13% of the taxpayers were in the top marginal tax bracket when John Howard was Prime Minister. There's now only 13% in the top marginal tax bracket. So a lot less people are now in the top marginal tax bracket. We're still paying the price for those unaffordable Howard Costello tax cuts at the end. We don't want to make the mistake again.
Right. Hang on, men. What would you like to say, sister?
Actually, Ben, you're just talking through your hat. Actually, there are only 4% who are in the top marginal tax rate. I don't know where you get your figures from. That's right. And under the new plan, there will be 6% in the top marginal tax rate. So there you can say it's great. It's going to be more progressive than the current arrangement. So you should be giving it the big tick.
I'm going to move on to a question from a woman, Emma Frampton.
Why does the Coalition and now Labor think that handing out cash is a vote winner? The Coalition describes itself as sensible economic managers. So why wouldn't the sensible thing be to ignore the sugar hit of tax cuts and instead fortify our fiscal position so we're prepared in case of another global crisis?
Yeah, Angus, now this is a critique that you're getting from all over the place, from high-level economists and commentators, George Megalogenis on the weekend. What's your answer to that?
Well, I'd make a couple of points. First and most importantly is I think we can do both. I think we can get the budget back into the strong position you rightly argued it needs to be in, Emma, in order to survive if there's some kind of shock to the system. But at the same time, there is a very strong argument in the short term for some compensation for lower and middle income taxpayers to get an increase in their incomes. We think in time that will be overtaken by increases in real wages. And the key here is to have an economy that's growing, that's investing, and the low to middle income tax offset, as it's called, then can be replaced with rising wages. That is the key to the plan. And I think it is a fair plan because it's got that mix of longer-term tax reform, medium-term tax reform, as well as the short-term improvement.
Angus, just to pick up on the questioner's point and the critique that's out there, Australia was in good shape coming up to the GFC because Peter Costello, your treasurer, paid off all of Australia's debt. If there's another international economic crisis, we're deeply in debt. What are you going to do about it?
Well, we're bringing it back as of this year. The net debt will be falling. It'll fall $30 billion over the forward estimates. That's the 4 years of the budget. And then another $230 billion over the course
Let's not
of 10
forget
years.
Peter Costello, the same former treasurer, says that the rate we're paying back the debt, all of us will be dead.
Well, I've just given you the numbers, and unless... I think Peter Costello is going to be around for a while. He's looking pretty healthy at the moment. But, look, the truth is that we are paying back a significant amount of the debt over the course of...
All right, let's hear from others. And Elizabeth, on this question, because it's one of the fundamental critiques of both Labor and the coalition government.
I think tax cuts for low-income earners in particular are supported. I think in an environment of low to no wage growth and increasing household bills, that's a sensible thing to do. But we've had 26, 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and some of the figures in the budget, 3% growth each year, GDP growth, 2.5% wage growth, are, shall we say, optimistic. And we're not well placed if there's a downturn. And we could believe we'll have 31, 35 uninterrupted years. But
so if we're not well placed, if there's a downturn,
we should be paying down debt.
Are we vulnerable?
We're vulnerable, yes.
So the questioner is right about that.
And probably the majority of this audience wouldn't have experienced a downturn, a recession. It's some of us can remember, but it is tough, and we're not necessarily well placed as a community and a society for that.
Chris Bowen, are we vulnerable? And if so, you've doubled down on tax cuts as the Labor opposition.
Well, I actually think we are vulnerable and we need to do better on budget repair. That is correct. It's good that the budget's getting back to surplus, so it would be difficult not to in the current global economic environment. 120 economies around the world experiencing growth. That's a good thing. But there's plenty of downside risk in the world economy. We don't need to go through what they are. Some of them are pretty self-evident. We need strong, sustainable budget surpluses going forward. And because the government is engaging in this sort of long-term tax plan when the revenue is not certain, I think that is in danger and is at risk. We support the tax cuts for low and middle income earners, and indeed we will do better. We will do better for low and middle income earners, as Elizabeth and Angus have both said. Wages growth is at record lows. A lot of people have lost wages through penalty rate cuts. Cost of living issues are real. And it's been a long time since a low income earner got a tax cut in Australia. So we think they're justified. But the reason why we, the Labor Party, can actually say, yes, we'll do better on income tax and we'll have a better budget repair plan, of which I'll talk about a lot more detail in due course, is because we've made other hard decisions. We didn't reply to the budget 2 days after it was delivered and think of all the policies in between. We've engaged in difficult decisions on negative gearing reform, capital gains tax reform, a dividend imputation, making the tax system better and fairer, which has created us the room to engage in personal income tax cuts, but also have a better budget repair plan.
So put simply, are you making the claim that you're taking from the rich and making the tax burden on richer people higher so that you can give to poorer or middle income people? Is it as simple as that?
Well, what we're doing is closing down and or reforming tax concessions, which are regressive, which do benefit high income earners primarily. That's a fact. And we're looking at them. We've looked at them, either closing them down or reforming them to make them fairer and better and more fit for purpose. And that's created us a lot of budget room. We'll have good, sustainable budget surpluses. I mean, Peter Costello used to have budget surpluses as high as 2% of GDP. We're not projected to get anywhere near that under the government's plans, anywhere near that at any point over the next decade. And so what we need is good, sustainable budget surpluses, and that takes tough decisions. And you can do more than one thing in politics. You have to do more than one thing. You can engage in tax reform for low and middle income earners. We can engage in what we think is better funding for health and education. Angus talked before about extravagant spending plans. I'd like to hear what they are. I mean, I don't think better health and education funding is an extravagant spending plan.
But before you go down that path, Christopher, I'm going to bring you back to the question. So, given that you want to be responsible with the budget, if there is a global financial crisis, the sort of thing that Elizabeth just warned we're not prepared for, would you shelve your tax cuts?
Well, the tax cuts are immediate. Right? That's not going to happen. I don't think there's a global financial crisis in 2018 or 19. We're talking about medium-term risks. But
tax cuts last forever. So here's the question. How are you going to pay for the problems that we face if there's another global financial crisis and the country's deeply in debt?
Well, because, Tony, what we've done is engage, as I said, in those difficult decisions. I mean, big sweeping changes we are proposing from opposition, big levers that we're pushing to make the tax system fairer, and they do raise a lot of money over the short and medium term, some of them, and they do provide room for governments to say, OK, we want better budget surpluses, we can afford tax cuts for low and middle income earners, but only because we've engaged in that policy work, which the government just refuses to do. And we've done it in a holistic fashion. I'm sure you'll talk
more about that later. I want to hear from Judith Sloan and take it back to the question about whether we're vulnerable.
Well, I mean, I was quite surprised that the government didn't spend more than it did, to tell you the truth. I mean, what was probably the outstanding feature of the budgetary position is that there has been a surge in revenue, both in terms of income tax revenue, not because of wage growth, but because of the sheer increase in the number of people in employment, but also perhaps more heartening for the government, there's been a surge in company tax revenue. So they're basically playing with an additional $35 billion over the forward estimates. Now, in the past, I could see governments just spending that, right? And basically the Treasurer decided to kind of use half for budget repair and half for tax cuts and a few other things. And I think at that point, they're bringing the surplus back a year earlier. Admittedly, it's very small. And then the surplus in 2021 is now quite substantial. I don't think we need to be too nervous, Nellie. By international standards, our net government debt is pretty low, by the way. And yes, by all means be prepared, but I don't think you have to be foreseeing some catastrophe. I think the truth of the matter is that we could raise additional finances if things really went south. So I would hate to see that really kind of driving policy in a sort of an immediate sense anyway.
OK, we've got a lot of questions to get through. Next one's from Jack Lording.
Hi panel. Hi Tony. My question is, being a university student, I benefit from dividend imputation from shares. Why does Labor want to get rid of this benefit, which helps so many people like myself, but more importantly, retirees?
Hey Jack, just before we go on, because a lot of people are thinking university student, got a portfolio of shares and you're getting dividend imputations. How'd you manage to do that?
Oh, it's just I work 2 jobs, just part-time while study. So it's only a very small portfolio. And, I do my tax return and I get a few dollars back at the end of the financial year. So, it helps me, but more importantly, I'd like to know, the impact on retirees or myself. Say, if I took a gap year, you'd lose that benefit. OK, Chris Bowen, one of the most controversial parts of your proposed reform. So
one of the things I was talking about, difficult decisions, but necessary for the budget. Now, we're keeping dividend imputation. Dividend imputation is saying to people, the company has paid tax. When you get your dividends from the company you own shares in, we're not going to tax you on those shares because the company's already paid tax. Fair enough, but that was a Labor invention and it's a very important one and we stand with it. But when it was changed in 2000, when the budget was in a much better position than it is now, what was said was, it doesn't matter. If you haven't paid any income tax, we'll give you a refund. And now what's that really saying is the company's paid the tax and we're going to give it back to you, the shareholder, i.e. nobody's going to pay any tax. Net tax take from that company, 0 for those who own shares and haven't paid income tax. Now, that's not double taxation. That's getting rid of any taxation of that company. And that's not sustainable anymore. And it's not fair. Where we've got the situation, this is costing $6 billion a year. Now, you're at uni. I'm sure you want to see unis well funded. We've just made a good announcement about that. We want to fund TAFE, etc. $6 billion a year, growing because of changes in the demography of our country, to $8 billion a year in the foreseeable future. That's more than the Commonwealth Government spends on public schools, on those refunds to people who haven't paid income tax. It's 3 times what we spend on the Australian Federal Police.
So, Chris Bowen, how much of that will Labor take back and put into general revenue?
Well, look, with all these things, we don't hypothecate one policy and say, right, this money we're spending on schools and this money we're spending on hospitals.
No, how much are you going to get from changing the dividend imputation refunds?
Well, about $10 billion over the forward estimates.
OK.
Yeah. And that's, of the election, from the election onwards. That's very substantial.
So that's $10 billion comes from somebody, right?
That's correct.
What you've heard the Treasurer say over the weekend is that's going to come from nanas.
And importantly...
What he's talking about is self-funded retirees.
Yeah. And importantly, the protected pensioners.
You're prepared for the hit that you will take in an election from penalising those people?
With all the decisions we've made, we've done it with our eyes wide open that they're politically controversial, whether it was negative gearing reform, family trust reform, which 3 Treasurers have tried and failed. We've said we've done it. We've got a detailed policy. There's going to be people who aren't happy about not having as much refund from the government.
Good for rich people, isn't it? Because you see, if you pay tax, you get the full benefit of the franking credits. So that's fantastic. Well, Chris, I'm glad you like those really rich people. It's just those...
They're paying income tax and they're working in the system.
Well, that's great because, those people, those struggling self-funded retirees are just a little bit above the age pension entitlement. They miss out. So you're happy for, like, a worker, take, $10,000 income per annum cut. That's fine by you, is it?
Oh, if you're a worker...
But if you're rich, it's fine. You keep it.
Well,
keep the benefit.
It's
a really weird Labor policy.
Well, it's actually a policy entirely in keeping, Judith, with our approach, which is to say if you paid income tax...
Self-funded retirees who are just a little above the age pension entitlement.
Am I going to get a go now? OK.
Yep.
If you're paying income tax, you can get an income tax refund.
I've got the rich people, they're OK.
Well, if they're paying a lot of income tax because they're working and they're paying the tax, sure, we won't tax them twice. We won't tax it twice.
Okay.
But we're also not taxing... We're not taxing a dividend imputation credit that somebody receives when they're not paying income tax. We're not going to apply tax to it. We're just not going to pay a refund. That would mean, as I said, no tax is paid.
But you are to the pensioners and you are to the charities.
Judith,
if you're against exempting pensioners and charities, you can argue.
Point. I just want to hear from the other side of politics, and we'll hear from Angus Taylor.
Well, I mean, the extraordinary thing about this is that we've just had this discussion about fairness, and it's actually people on low taxable incomes who are going to be hit hardest by exactly what you just described. The $10 billion is going to come from people with low taxable incomes. Now, good on you, Jack. 2 jobs, working hard as a student. Well done, mate. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about having a crack. Fantastic stuff. But the truth is that the people who are going to lose here are people on low taxable incomes. There's lots of older people in my electorate who are essentially on very little income. They rely on $3,000 or $4,000 of these franking credits, and they have been to their accountants and their financial planners in the last 6 or 8 weeks, and they have realised what Labor's going to do to them. Chris, this is a very bad policy. It's a big mistake.
And are you regarding it as an election-winning policy, possibly this year?
Look, Chris is using it to pay for his spending promises over the forwards because he's getting...
which spending promises?
Yeah, well, you outlaid a whole lot of them or your leader did, in the budget reply, and we're really looking forward to seeing the numbers because we haven't seen any of the numbers. But the truth is this is giving you $10 billion alongside capital gains tax, negative gearing, $200 billion of taxes. You spent a whole lot of that at the last election. You're now spending it all over again. The numbers just don't add up. But I tell you what, the nanas are going to pay for this. There's no doubt about it.
I'll come back to you, Christopher Bowen and Ben Oquist.
Just quickly, though, we do need to raise the revenue from somewhere. And if it's not here, it's going to be somewhere else. Australia is a low-taxing country by OECD standards, the 8th lowest in the OECD, and taxes are the price we pay for civilised society. And if we want a world-class education system, a world-class health system, if we want to build the infrastructure for our growing population, the money's got to come from somewhere. And I think maybe the public is ready for that debate, ready to think, well, maybe a little bit more tax, a little bit more revenue to pay for a decent society and address inequality. We might be all willing to do that.
Elizabeth, can I bring you in here? And, I mean, do you think that this... Well, let's say, do you think the Howard government went too far in offering the kind of refunds it was offering to self-funded retirees? Was it affordable? And is it right to pin it back?
Well, I probably should declare I'm a not yet self-funded retiree. I think the problem goes back to about that time. And what anybody in this audience, whether student like Jack or self-funded retirees, know is that these constant changes to people's plans have long-term implications. And I think we need an adult conversation about what our super includes. And Judith has started some of that conversation about young people and super and life insurance. And I think there's a real challenge there to deal with that at one end of the age scale. And then for those people at retirement or near retirement, the constant changing to pensions and imputation means people almost despair of being able to plan for a reasonable and secure retirement.
Sure, but the question is, did the Howard government go too far at a time when they had more revenue and were able to be generous to such people?
Hindsight's a wonderful thing. I think that, if we'd had something like the Norwegian Sovereign Fund, we would probably not be having some of these debates now. That is, if we'd put money into long-term investment for the country rather than giving it to the likes of people like me, has happened, then we'd be in a different space.
I'm just going to pause you there for a moment. We've got a Twitter question just come in from Peter Johnson. How can anyone plan for a stable financial retirement when politicians frequently change the rules for superannuation or the age pension? Chris Bowen, that's one for you. And again, there's going to be a big political price to pay if people like that turn on you in the election.
Look, I completely understand that question. And just while we're finishing on dividend imputation refundability, I mean, we're the only country in the world which does this. that has fully refundable imputation, which says we're going to send you a cheque even if you haven't paid income tax. We're the only country in the world that does it. It's not sustainable. And most tax concessions are not refundable. The government just introduced the low and middle income tax offset. We support it. It's not refundable. You don't get a tax refund below. You can't get your taxable income down below zero. Of course you can't. It wouldn't work. It's not sustainable. On the question, though, the particular question about regular changes, yeah, I understand that very much. I understand that principle. I understand what Elizabeth's saying. Of course, as the alternative government, we have to prepare our policies, seek a mandate. We're doing that well in advance of the election, plenty of warning of our changes. We're not springing them on people at the last minute. Dividend imputation refundability's existed since 2000. It wasn't refundable. It worked quite well between 1987 and 2000. But going forward, if we do win the election and we implement those changes, I do understand very much the point that gets made. And let's be honest, both sides have done it. Labor and Liberal have both done it. A treasurer is short of a bit of money, trying to get to surplus. You think, well, the Treasury says, well, you can change the superannuation rules and there's a few hundred million or $1 billion and that'll get you to surplus. It's happened under both sides. We need to take superannuation out of the budget cycle so that it's not a temptation every budget for a treasurer to say, well, let's just make this last.
You mean after you take from it,
no.
Then you need to go back? No one does that again.
No, well, we are going to the election with a set of policies. Of course we are. Of course, I mean, we're not an echo chamber. We're not going to say everything's perfect the way it is. We're never going to make any changes. We're not going to do that. Things have to change. The budget's not currently sustainable. It's not currently... the tax system should be fairer. But what we will also do is then implement what we're calling a Council of Superannuation Custodians to say, well, every 5 years, not every year, every 5 years, let's check and see whether anything needs to be changed, do it through a transparent process, link it to the intergenerational report, have a proper process to consider these things, weigh up the pros and cons, have it open and for public submissions, and then make recommendations to the government of the day out of the annual cycle. So at the moment, it's in the annual cycle, and both sides attempted to make that.
I'm just going to move to our next question because I'm going to go from retirees to the other end of the spectrum. I've got a question from Ryan Kalimlin.
Thank you. So today I celebrate my graduation from university. I look forward to 40 plus years of a working life. However, current economic and industrial relations policies leave many in my cohort with little hope for job security, fair wage rises, or the ability to own our own homes. Do you believe that this budget does enough for young people, or is it merely a pork barrel to baby boomers in an election year?
Let's start with the non-politicians, and I'll start with Ben Oquist.
Well, I do think the budget hasn't addressed that big issue of wage growth. There are assumptions for 3.5% wage growth, I think as somebody mentioned, in the out years, but no real policies to get to that wage growth. And on the other hand, there's a modest tax cut. That's if you want tax cuts, at least they're well targeted. But give you this figure, that if you had that 3.5% wage rise and you're on 60 grand, which is not a bad wage, not far from the median, if you had that 3.5% pay rise by 2020, instead of a $530 tax cut, you'd be getting $6,000 extra a year. And I think you're right. There's something structurally wrong in our economy and our rules and the system that is not allowing wages to grow. And the government just forecasting it is not going to make it happen. And I think we need to look at the rules. Employees clearly don't have as much power as they used to. And the rules aren't set up to allow them to have wage growth. And that's bad for our society. But we now know it's bad for our economy. And the IMF, the OECD, our own RBA, all warning about the dangers of inequality and low wage growth, not just for our society, but for the economy, and we need to change the structures to allow those wages to grow faster.
Elizabeth, let me take you to another part of that question, because we've got quite a few questions on housing affordability from young people. And did you see anything in the budget to address the concerns that young people have that they'll never be able to buy into the housing market? Not in the budget, no. And speaking as a baby boomer, there was probably more in it for me than there was for you and your generation. And you know, as somebody who benefited from free university education, I know, and I have a daughter and grandchildren, I know the struggles that people are going through today. And I think the whole issue of fairness and equality, which is what this country stands for, does need to be addressed, because buying a home, especially in Sydney and Melbourne,
paying back HECS and the like is very difficult.
So Labor's got the most radical plan for housing. How do you rate their policy of reforming negative gearing and capital gains to slow the kind of investor-driven market?
It's, as I said earlier, as part of the total tax reform, the AICD supports reforms to negative gearing because it's, until recently at least anyway, it's been an investor's market rather than... Capital
gains as well?
And reforms to capital gains tax, yes.
Judith?
On the issue of wages growth, though, I mean, I know it seems very low, but it's wrong to think of it just as an Australian phenomenon. Wages growth is extraordinarily low in developed economies. In fact, our figure looks quite high. So it's lower in the UK, for example. It's been very, very low in the US. It's even low in somewhere like Germany, which has probably the kind of wage-setting arrangements you would think were great. There's something clearly going on. Unemployment, underemployment in the UK, US, much lower than here.
Judith, can you see why young people, like our questioner, would be looking at this budget and thinking there's not much here for me?
But I don't think there aren't any particular barriers either. If we look at employment growth, for example, you know, there are over 400,000 jobs created in the last 12 months, and most of them were full-time, and most of them actually went to people with degrees. So in that sense, we had seen, I think, a considerable lull in the percentage of university graduates who are getting full-time jobs, partly because there's been such a surge in the number of university graduates. It's a supply phenomenon. But in that sense, I think you can look fairly positively about your prospects. I mean, you know, the labour market is like a travelator, right? It's very, very important to take that first step on the travelator. Hopefully it's actually an escalator for you. And therefore, you know, once you can get onto that first step where there's some sort of career prospects, that's what happens to most graduates. And
okay.
So I don't, you know, I think it's the wrong question to say, what did the budget do for that? What would you expect the budget to do? You want the budget to create an environment in which employment growth can continue to flourish.
Not a question for me, it's a question raised by the questioner. Yeah. So I'll go to Chris Bowen.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, Rayanne, congratulations on your graduation today. I hope you're celebrating as well as coming to Q&A. I hope you're going to have some other form of celebration tonight as well, but it's a great effort. Good on you. This
is a celebration of the economy.
I'm sure. I'm sure everybody who's graduated today wishes they're in the Q&A audience and not at the pub, but well done to you. Look, more broadly than the budget, to be fair, there are intergenerational equities issues that we need to address. Budget's part of it, and there are broader issues. Housing affordability is the key one, to my mind. I mean, young people look at the housing market and think, how will I ever buy in? And they're right. I look at the housing market and think, how would I have bought in if it was, you know, like it was when I was buying a house 20 or so years ago? It is just increasingly out of reach for people, and so something has got to give. And negative gearing is a key part of that reform, to put first home buyers on a more level playing field with investors. Investing is important, but the tax system, we don't need it. Again, we have the most generous property tax concessions in the world. So, of course, investors are attracted to get into the market, and that does put first home buyers at a disadvantage when they're turning up to try and get a house at an auction.
So if you actually manage to do this, do you think housing prices will go down?
I think it will take the heat.
Is that actually your aim? Because how otherwise will they buy into the housing market?
Well, the aim is to take some of the heat out of the rises. And yes, some of the heat's come off already, but let's not just say mission accomplished. I mean, there's
you want more heat to come out, meaning I imagine you want house prices to go down.
Tony, what I want is a tax system which is fit for purpose for 30 years. You don't make these changes very often.
So you do want a long-term plan?
Well, Angus, I mean, seriously. Well, there's a difference between a tax cut, you know, 7 years away and getting the policy settings right now, which would last for 30 years. You don't change negative gearing very often. It was last changed in the 80s, right? Yeah. So when you do it, you've got to get it right.
Less than a year it lasted then.
And you've got to get it right. And our policies are carefully designed and to engage in different market circumstances, because the market's going to change, of course, from one year to another. It's different in different cities at the same time. But the principle is we should not be giving the most generous property tax concessions in the world. It's bad for the budget. But also, if there's no impact on housing supply, I mean, more than 90% of negative gearing goes to existing houses. So there's no new supply coming on as a result. It's not increasing your chance of getting a house by increasing the stock.
Okay.
So it's not working.
Okay, Angus, yes, I'll bring you in. And the argument from the government is you're going to be penalising teachers and policemen who have multiple houses and all the rest of it. Pretty small group, really, though, in those you've targeted.
Sure, but let me just respond to Brian's question
go ahead.
first.
Of course,
come back to housing.
Yep.
Look, this is a budget focused on all Australians. We're not interested in the politics and economics of division. We're actually interested in a budget that's going to benefit everybody. And if we have strong rates of growth, if we have high rates of investment, strong jobs growth, we've been seeing over 1,000 jobs a day, mostly full-time over the last 12 months, extraordinary record jobs growth. I think that will translate to investment and wages growth. That's good for young Australians. It's good for all Australians. And I think this is what's really characterising this budget more than anything else is it's a budget for everyone. Let's stop talking about young versus old or doctors versus nurses or another business versus workers. Let's focus on a budget where jobs are being created for all Australians, where wages rise because we're seeing investment. We saw extraordinary rises in real wages during the mining boom.
Angus, can we just pause you because our questioner had his hand up. You can come back and answer it, but he's got a question. Go ahead.
I mean, I think it's all well and good, and I think the rhetoric is clearly there from both sides. But what we're seeing is that people from my generation have had, for example, our penalty rates cut. We've seen a weakening of our industrial relations laws so that people in my generation don't see a secure future in our jobs. You know, it's all well and good to say people are getting jobs, but we can't see ourselves in jobs for more than 2 or 3 years anymore like our parents used to. We can't forward plan to buy a house, and we aren't getting any help compared to the investors who are getting all the help from negative gearing and tax reforms. You know, I can't see anything in the future from this budget that is helping people like me and people like my partner who are trying to get ahead, and we're not being able to get ahead just because we happen to be not in that demographic.
But that's my point. My point is that if we've got jobs growth and they're full-time jobs, these are not part-time jobs, they're full-time jobs, coming on at a rapid rate, we know that if we see business investment rising, we saw it during the mining boom here in Australia, we had higher real wage growth than almost any other country in the world, this is Judith's point earlier. We will see those opportunities being created. They're being created now.
But Angus, he's going to come out of university with a lot of debt from his university course. They're going to try and get a job. They're saying the job market is not secure. You've created lots of full-time jobs, that's true. Yep. But he's not seeing that. He's seeing difficulties. And on top of that, you have to try and get into the housing market to do what their parents did, and as everyone knows, that's a hell of a lot harder now.
Come to my electorate, we'd love to have you. Our unemployment rate is down at 3%, one of the lowest unemployment rates in Australia. And houses are cheap, and we'll find you a house. We'd love to have you.
So everyone should... well, let's just go back to ask our questioner. Would you be happy to leave the city? I mean, that's what's being suggested here. You can find cheaper houses in regional Australia. He's saying there's jobs...
Oh, look, I'm not far from... I live in the neighbouring electorate to Mr Taylor. I live in Werriwa, which is right next to your Hume electorate. And even there, which is kind of on the far edge of Sydney, housing is ridiculously difficult to find. Now, that's avoidable for people like me. You know, we're not... You know, we are stuck essentially in a rental generation. And it's very difficult to see a future where I'm able to afford a home that is, you know, fit for purpose and where I can get to the jobs that are for my future.
OK, well, thank you very much for very eloquently expressing your position there. And I just want to... Dan, you want to jump in?
I just want to say, I think Rayanne is pointing to something that we kind of all know. There's something not quite right with the economy and the way it's working. We have had 27 years of economic growth. And with all respect to Mr Taylor, he's still suggesting that that model is just going to kind of trickle down and work for people. And it is... I know some people dismiss people who call it trickle-down economics, but that is... kind of existing economic paradigm has just said, you'll have this growth, you'll have this employment, and you'll all be happy. Well, we've had 27 years of economic growth, and a lot of people are not getting ahead anymore. A lot of people can't afford a house, and a lot of people get... There's a lot more insecure work. I grant you there has been some full-time job growth, but there's a lot more...
400,000.
A lot more insecure work than there was in the past.
There is, Ben. The figures absolutely show there isn't.
It's not true.
The proportion
whether
of
it's
the
part-time or
workforce...
casual or... There's a whole range of things that make it difficult, much more difficult for young people than it used to be.
Come on.
And mine too.
OK, we're going to...
The proportion of casual work has not changed for nearly 30 years. The proportion of part-time work has increased, but the vast majority of part-time workers want to be part-time. It's a really flexible labour market which has generated a lot of benefits for a lot of people, and I think you need to be incredibly optimistic because I think that's where it's heading, yeah.
OK, now remember, if you hear any... I'm not saying this is a doubtful claim, but remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Keely Symes.
Hi there. Will the by-elections become a referendum on the Turnbull government?
Yeah, Angus, the by-elections, we've got 5 of them coming up pretty soon. Yeah. Your view?
Well, I think the reason we're having them now, I know the reason we're having them now is because Bill Shorten ignored the earlier decision of the High Court, put his head in the sand and was in denial. Obviously now, with the Gallagher decision, the High Court has made it clear for the second time what the rules are, and so we're going to a...
So the questioner asks, is it a referendum? Will those by-elections be a referendum on your budget and the Turnbull government?
Well, my first point is that it should be a referendum on the credibility of Bill Shorten, and I think that's a very serious issue in the electorate. I hear it regularly, and I think given his behaviour over this, there's a real question in my mind. Now, there's no doubt there'll be substantive issues debated in those by-elections, and they should be. But I've got to tell you, I think most Australians want to see an Australia where we are seeing growth, we are seeing jobs being created, where we are seeing investment, and I think what our track record over the last few years in our time in government and the plans we're putting forward to give Australians the opportunities and aspirational Australians the chance to get ahead, I think they will serve us.
OK, so we're talking politics now, so put aside that rhetoric just for a minute. So imagine you win 1 or even 2 of those Labor seats. Will you go straight to an election?
Well, look, the truth of the matter is, and you know this well, is that winning seats from government, from the opposition, when in a by-election in mid-term is very tough. There's no doubt about that. And
if you do, is that an indication you should go very quickly to an election? Because the temptation's going to be there, let's face it.
That ultimately, of course, is a question for the Prime Minister, but he's made very clear that he's got no intention of going to an election before next year. So
at this time?
Well, he's been very clear.
We know that things change. I mean, and they change very quickly. If, for example, you won one of those by-elections, would you think just the temptation would be very strong?
His statements have been pretty unambiguous.
OK, all right. Now, I just want to hear from the politicians on this. Chris Bowen, it's going to be a referendum, actually, flip it, because Angus Taylor says it's going to be a referendum on Bill Shorten. And it's true that Labor's got a lot more to lose, isn't it?
Well, we've got 4 seats up for by-elections, that's true, and they're not particularly safe seats. They're not particularly safe seats. 2 of them in particular are marginal. Every by-election, every election is a combination of issues. We're more than happy to have it as a referendum on the Turnbull government. We're more than happy to put our plans, very clearly out for people to judge. The next general election is the real opportunity for the entire nation to express a view, but we are more than happy for the by-elections to be seen through that prism. Absolutely delighted to. We've got good candidates. Some people will vote on the quality of the candidates. Local members, they've been working hard for 2 years. Got caught up in this, and most people would say, well, they've been good members and we'll continue to back them. But there'll always be a range of issues that people vote on in any election or any by-election.
So Malcolm Turnbull's had a little bounce in Newspoll today, although another poll has a different story. But Newspoll is the one that most people are watching, particularly when it comes to Malcolm Turnbull. If he actually does win 1 or even 2 of those Labor seats, that'd be your nightmare scenario, wouldn't it?
Well, we don't want to lose them. No political party wants to lose a seat, particularly such good, hard-working local members who've been really working hard for the last few years, representing their communities. Of course, we're in it to win it. We're turning up. When Liberal Party isn't turning up for 2 of them, not running a candidate, you can't win unless you run. That's how it works. You've got to turn up.
Well, they're your seats.
They're our seats, so that's why you don't run.
It would be very odd if you didn't turn up.
Well, we're turning up. We're fighting to win. We believe we can win, of course. We've got great members, great candidates, and we've got better policies, which we're putting out there to vote on.
Let's go back to budgetary issues. We've got a question from Andrew Tran.
Whatever happened to tax reform? I mean, most of the tax changes in the budget were integrity measures. None of it is real reform. We know we have an over-reliance on income taxes, which is subject to massive fluctuations. I mean, we see the upside in this year's budget. But what if it all stops? What if China slows down or the economy fluctuates? Is this government, in fact, both sides of politics, risking Australia's prosperity and the living standards of all Australians by not having the courage to talk about real tax reform, including the GST?
Well, Elizabeth, you started us off on this, and no doubt you believe what you said earlier in the program, but let's go a bit further. So you answer his question, and maybe you could speculate on why governments have steered away from real tax reform.
Probably only Angus or Chris could answer that, but if I have a go at it, I think that part of the problem is the short electoral cycle. We have 3-year terms which effectively become 2.5-year terms, so we don't have medium to long-term planning. I think we as a community need to have a debate about raising and broadening the GST with, as I said before, compensation to people who'll be affected by that. The AICD, we've done the modelling on that. It allows you to make that compensation to lower personal income taxes and to lower company taxes, to deal with negative gearing, to deal with CGT. If you put it together as a package, then you can get a much better tax outcome. But it seems to be off the table, and I'd be interested to know. And every time we raise it, the AICD goes to Canberra once a year and talks to both sides of the government, the opposition and the crossbench, and we're told it's not on the table.
Well, when you mention GST, it's pretty simple, isn't it? Both sides are terrified by the electoral backlash from touching the GST.
Absolutely.
Despite the fact that many other countries do it regularly.
It's now one of the lowest in the OECD, and other countries, including New Zealand, have raised it and raised it successfully. I'm not pretending it's easy, but if we have a broad-based discussion about the need for tax reform, then I think both government and opposition can bring the community with them.
Just one quick question. Why is it that when it comes to discussions about tax reform, it always ends up being the first thing that's discussed is the GST? Aren't there other ways to broaden the tax base?
There are, but this budget shows it, we're very dependent on company taxes and personal income taxes, and that's not necessarily sustainable. And as other countries have been lowering, in particular, their company taxes, ours are now too high and we're not competitive in that area.
OK, I want to hear from Ben and Judith on this before I bring the politicians in. Ben, go ahead.
Well, there are ways of reforming the GST that aren't so regressive, and I do agree with you that somehow tax reform equals only increasing the GST, and there are many more taxes you could do. We should have a super profits tax on the mining industry. We should have a carbon tax. We should have a super profit tax on the bank. We should be addressing tax concessions.
Tax everything.
We should be addressing tax concessions in capital gains and negative gearing. We don't have, and something that I picked up from Chris Bowen the other day, we have an expenditure review committee. We don't have a revenue review committee. And it's fine for the ERC to go through how to cut the ABC or how to cut spending on housing or education or health, but tax concessions need to be looked at as well. And they are the key part that we need to address in tax reform. And congratulations, though, to both the Labor Party and the government who did do something about addressing superannuation tax concessions. They did need addressing. Something was done. There was kind of bipartisanship. More needs to be done in that space. But it shows that tax reform can happen, but it's not just about the GST.
OK, Judith, and this goes back to Ken Henry and many others before him saying we need to reform our tax system, root and branch. We don't just need to do these little things here and there. What do you think? That's the questioner's point, Andrew's point.
Well, actually, I don't think I agree, to tell you the truth. I mean, you know, what happened to the Henry Tax Review? It collected dust almost immediately, and you picked up the one really bad idea in it, the mining tax, which lasted, 18 months. So, no, that was a very bad thing. I think the thing is, it's what von Hayek calls the fatal conceit, that, you know, if just wise people like Ben and Chris, you know, got together and formed a committee and they could, and maybe put Elizabeth on it, you know, they could get together and they could figure out how the good burgers can get taxed, right? Now, you quote countries that have got higher GSTs. Our economic performance has been miles superior to those countries with high GST. I don't know why we'd want to do that. And I don't know why you'd want a higher GST, Ben, because, you know, it hurts poor people.
I don't necessarily. We've had 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth with a company tax rate as it is. So to me, that's evidence of why the company tax rate should stay the same. But there are other taxes that you could change. There are tax concessions you could get rid of. There's no harm in looking at other tax reform other than the GST. But big picture, we need to think, how much money do we need to raise to build the type of society we want, and I think that's more than we currently
What's
have.
the,
All right, Judith,
what's the least
I'll
amount
get
of
you to
money
finish
we
your
want
answer
to
and
raise,
we'll move to the politicians. Go ahead.
we don't want to be maximising the amount of money we want to raise. We want to raise the least amount in the most efficient way. But you see, I think it's a holy grail, tax reform. Let's not keep talking about it, and let's not dismiss what might seem, you can dismiss them as piecemeal, but, you know, there's a 7-year plan that the government's put out. You know, let's think about it. You know, everyone complains about short term. This is longer term. You've got some plans, Chris. Let's talk about this. The idea that there's some sort of perfect birthday cake with all the bits and pieces of tax reform in, that's not how it's worked overseas either.
Okay.
Let's do, you know, and there's also, can I just finish by saying, there's a really important saying in economics, which is an old tax is a good tax. And the reason that is that the sort of compliance costs are basically sunk. And so every time you flip this stuff up, you change negative gearing, you change the super tax rules and stuff, the compliance costs are extremely high, and people quite legitimately get upset and get actually bad advice as well. So there is, I think, a really good argument for sort of keeping the core basically the same and working at the margins.
Chris Bowen.
I'm a bit more optimistic than I think you are about tax reform. I actually agree with Judith. You don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to. I don't agree with the, you know, unless you do it all, then you shouldn't do anything, because it's been tried and it is hard, because you find that everybody who opposes one little change then opposes the whole package.
But you have concluded you need to broaden the tax base,
yes.
otherwise you wouldn't be doing all your increases.
Well, we spent the first part of the show, you know, with you asking me about if I was worried about the political backlash from tax reform, our tax reform. That's not lack of courage on our behalf. On the contrary, I would put to you, we do have the courage to take it to the people. It is tax reform. You might agree with it, you might agree with some parts of it, not others, but we're putting a package together and it hangs together. It's at the end, by the time we get the election, a total package. We haven't had I mean, Tony Abbott said, oh, we're going to have a big white paper and we're going to... It didn't work. We never saw the white paper. Much better to go through and identify the things in the tax system that you think should be improved, argue for them, make the case, and then win the arguments and put it as a part of a holistic package that the Australian people can judge. I agree. I don't think tax reform should just be about the GST. There's all sorts of reasons why I don't support increasing the GST. When the government was talking about it, I said you'd need to spend most of the money on compensation to low-income earners. It turns out the government spent 6 months talking about it, then came out and said, oh, we need to spend most of the money compensating low-income earners, so we won't do it. You could put the GST on fresh food, you could. That would make it simpler. But that's a very poor signal to send to people to make fresh food more expensive when we're facing diabetes issues and obesity issues across the country.
OK, I've got to bring... we're going to run out of time. We've got another question to go to, but I want to hear you on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tony, look, I think this is tax reform. And Andrew, thanks for your question, but I think a reasonable definition of tax reform is tax changes that are going to drive economic growth, productivity, investment, jobs. And I think this will. And if you look at it, reducing the company tax rate from 30% down to 25%, which was already in motion, and we'd like Labor to join us on the remainder of that, as well as really significant changes to the structure of personal income tax, getting to the point where a large proportion of Australians will know that if they earn an extra dollar, they're only going to pay 32.5 cents in the dollar. They know they're going to keep 67.5 cents. Now that's really profound. It has a big impact on people's behaviour, and that's what tax reform is all about. It's about changing people's behaviour in a positive way. That's exactly what this budget is seeking to do, and what these tax changes, I think, will achieve. OK, we've got time for one last question. It's from Luke Broadhurst.
So part of the budget assumes that there'll be a 3.75% wage increase in about 4 years' time, while the government sets a maximum of 2% for the public service. So can we really believe the assertions made in budgets, or are they just political spin?
Yeah, Elizabeth, you mentioned this earlier. Do you think it's just not realistic that wages are going to increase the degree the budget suggests?
And Judith rightly said this is not just an Australian problem, and it is hard to see where that level of wages growth is going to come from in the next few years. And the budget is
did
predicated...
Treasury get this wrong? Because, you know, these figures have obviously come from somewhere. The Treasury didn't make them up in his head. They're Treasury figures, but they're pretty heroic. So they're wrong, in your opinion?
I'd like to think that in 3 or 4 years' time that'll be the level of wage growth that we're seeing, but we're not seeing it now.
And if they're wrong, what's the implications for the budget?
We won't be at surplus a year earlier than as the budget predicates.
Judith, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, they're only 3.5% at the end of the forwards, as we say, Chris, as you will remember when you were the treasurer. But yeah, look, I think they are on the optimistic side. But you know, where in the circles I move, you know, the labour market's pretty tight.
Exactly.
So really it's about employers bidding up because they're going to find it hard to get workers. So it could switch around reasonably quickly, as a matter of fact. So we also need to keep a watch of what's going through with the enterprise agreements, because it's a bit of a stock and a flow thing. So an enterprise agreement lasts 3 years, right? And so in order to pick up, you need to be getting a turnover of the enterprise agreements that are containing higher increases. Otherwise, you know, when you go to measure it, you don't see a tick up. I'm sure there will be a tick up. Whether it will be quite where Treasury is or the Reserve Bank is, who knows?
OK, we're running out of time, but Chris Bowen, a critical figure. Wages growth has been stagnant for such a long time. People are suffering. These small tax cuts are quite welcome for that reason.
Yeah, that's right, for all the reasons we discussed at the beginning. But to get to the question of all the forecasts and projections in the budget, that's the one I really quibble with. I mean, most of them I think are probably fair enough. I'll give the budget a tick where I can, and most of those projections are fair enough. Wages is the big one, which is very optimistic, and it has a big impact on the projected budget surplus, no doubt about it. We all hope it's true, but it's a huge risk. In a Labor government, we would have the Parliamentary Budget Office do those forecasts, completely independent of the government, completely independent of me as the Treasurer of the day, just to put that extra bit of rigour and independence into the process.
So just a quick one before we move on to the other panellists, and that is, does Labor have a plan in government to make sure that you break the wage stagnation? Can you guarantee that wages will go up under Labor?
Well, wages will always be primarily a factor of the labour market, but we have been looking at things like, well, we would reverse the penalty rates cut. We had been saying a lot about wages theft, for example, and we had been engaged in a very deep consultation process with business and unions and across the board about sensible changes that could be made, and we're going through that process. And the fact of the matter is, everybody agrees that it would be a good thing that wages go up more. Everybody, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Judith and Ben would probably agree.
I guess the point that I'm making is a Labor government in union with the unions, if I can put it that way, or along with the unions, might decide to agree to a big campaign for wage increases from the...
Well, at the end of the day, a campaign for wages increases isn't a matter for the government today. We would make a minimum wage submission, as we have from opposition, and we would call for increases. That's the sensible role for a government to play, and we've been doing that as an opposition.
OK, Angus.
Look, I think the biggest downside risk to wages, the wages forecasts in the budget, is actually not getting these tax reforms through, frankly. We saw Australia with very strong wages growth through the mining boom because we had a lot of business investment. We've got to have that investment happening. It's been picking up. We need to give the incentives there for businesses to invest, to employ more people, for people to work hard. And that will yield rising wages. I have no doubt whatsoever that the job market is tight. I'm seeing it on the ground. I think the conditions are there for increases in real wages, and as long as the incentives are there for businesses to continue to invest, I think we'll see the flow through to real wages.
A quick final word, Ben Oquist.
For most of my adult life, there was a whole campaign and governments and politicians working out how to stop wage rises and how we had to keep them down. The reality is we put in place structures to keep them down. We need new structures and new rules that will allow wages to grow faster, because without it, we won't meet those government forecasts. And to your point, it is total hypocrisy of the government to forecast 3.5% wages growth but demand that the public sector only have 2%. They could start by eliminating that cap in the public sector. That would help them get to the 3.5% they say they want us to get to.
Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Judith Sloan, Chris Bowen, Elizabeth Proust, Angus Taylor and Ben Oquist. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by PwC's Chief Economist, Jeremy Thorpe. Next Monday on Q&A, the philosopher behind animal liberation and The Most Good You Can Do, Peter Singer. The foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, whose latest book is a defence of Christianity, God is Good for You. Victorian Liberal Senator Jane Hume and Tasmanian Labor Senator and Shadow Minister for Regional Development, Julie Collins. Until next week's Q&A, good night.